I get asked about this subject quite often, and to be honest, I've been quite hesitant to do a video like this because, in all honesty, I actually don't feel like I'm good enough to be telling people what to do or how they should do things. So I'm just going to show you guys how I go about shooting my own images, some of the things I've learned through trial and error over the years, and hopefully you're able to get something out of it. I will also cover how I go about editing these images, but that one is going to be another video, a separate video all by itself. I absolutely love trying to capture marine animals with the drone, and it's been responsible for some of the most memorable experiences I've had in my journey as a photographer so far. There's just something amazing and captivating about them that I've never actually been able to find the words to describe how I feel about it correctly. But I'll be honest with you, it's also the single most frustrating thing that I do as a creative. It's even more frustrating than FPV. You need to accept from the very beginning that you're going to spend a lot of time searching and looking and chasing, and you're going to have nothing at all to show for it. The bad days outnumber the good days by a monumental amount. So if you're looking for quick results with little or no effort, then go and find something else, mate, because this is definitely not the photography niche for it. So we need to answer 3 things for this one: where, when, and how. How do I know where to look? It's a fucking good question. Ocean's kind of big, and we need to do whatever we can to narrow down that search area. Social media is going to be a friend here, with photography and drone groups being really good potential sources of information. Full disclaimer though, I've found that this subject is one that can harbour a hell of a lot of gatekeeping from locals. Unfortunately, there's not much you can do about that one. I only bring it up just to suggest that you keep an open mind about information that you may get from social media and just don't take it as gospel. But maybe someone's posted some marine animal images that's near your location, and you can maybe just try reaching out to them and be like, hey mate, love your work. I'd really like to be able to try and produce something like this myself. I was just wondering if you've got any tips, or if you'd maybe even be nice enough to share a location, but totally understand that if you don't want a location drop and things like that. If you're lucky, they'll offer you some assistance, but just don't take offense to it if they don't. Now, I can't believe I'm gonna have to point this one out, but if you're asking for something from someone, especially a stranger on social media, the least you can do is be fucking polite about it. Most of my followers over on Instagram would know of and understand my absolute disdain and disgust for the whole "where is this" mentality that a lot of people have. Another potential source of good information about marine critters is going to be diving and snorkeling related social media groups. I'm lucky in that my wife is actually a dive instructor and works for one of the local dive companies on the weekend, and I have access to their vast amount of knowledge if and when I need it, and it does come in super handy at times. So you could find some localized dive snorkel groups in your own area and reach out there, and you might have some luck with that as well. I wouldn't bother wasting my time asking within fishing groups and things like that. Whilst I have no doubt that there would be people in those groups that would have the exact info that you're after, I've found over the years that anybody involved in fishing, they're very, very protective of their spots and the things that they know, and they're more than likely going to feed you false information and point you in the completely wrong direction than actually be of any help to you. A last resort can also be searching hashtags on social media and trawling through the results, and you can find some info that way. It can work, but it's also extremely time consuming. That's why I refer to it as a last resort. Once you've narrowed down the area and answered the where, then welcome to the first source of massive frustration, which is shooting conditions. Weather conditions, ocean conditions, time of day. There's a hell of a lot of things that need to line up for you. I'm definitely not going to claim to be an expert on this one. It's a tricky subject, especially making a judgment call on ocean conditions. It's an art form in itself, and it just comes with experience. Time of day is actually easy enough. You want to be either early morning or late arvo. Middle section of the day is just a complete write-off because you can't avoid the glare when you're shooting top down and you've got the sun directly above you. All of my own images are like from the first 4 hours of morning light. So from sunrise, 4 hours past that. Anything past 4 hours and glare starts to become a problem. And the reason I'm always shooting in the morning is just because here in Perth, the sea breeze kicks in the afternoon, and it usually gets a hell of a lot windier. Every area is going to be unique in its own way, but what you're always looking for as a bare minimum is low wind and low swell, as both of these will create surface chop, which is just going to give you distorted silhouettes and terrible images. On the subject of wind, just a really quick reminder to pay attention to the direction of the wind. Make sure you know if you're going to be flying into a headwind or not when you're returning back with the drone. And if you are going to be returning into a headwind, just make sure you've got enough battery left to actually make it back home. Don't rely on the automated prompts from within the app and things like that telling you that you've only got enough battery to return home. The app doesn't know that you're going to be flying into a headwind and you're going to need more battery to get back home. The single biggest reason that you'll see somebody lose a drone over water is because they didn't account for a headwind and it ran out of battery before it got back home. Other important factors can also be the swell period and tidal information. The swell period is the average gap between the swell or the wave peaks, and generally speaking, the bigger the gap, the better. And this is because even if you've got low swell, if you've got a really short swell gap, it can still lead to unwanted surface chop. Tidal variation is another one that I've found that can have an impact on visibility as well. If you have a big difference between the high tide and the low tide figure, it's going to have a negative impact on visibility because it won't let the area clear up as quickly as what it otherwise could. The bigger the difference between the two figures, the more water that's going to be moving and the stronger the tidal currents. It's more of a problem if there's been bad weather recently in the area and it's already been stirred up a little bit. It's just going to make it take even longer for everything to sort of settle back down and for the visibility to clear up again. Now, there's a million different apps you can get for this sort of information, and everybody's always got their own preferences with this sort of thing. Myself, I prefer to use Windy and Seabreeze. Seabreeze is usually pretty accurate for my area, and it has other useful bits of info like live wind data from a whole heap of locations. That can be super useful for checking against what the forecast is to see how accurate that forecast might be for any given day. Visibility is definitely just a massively frustrating subject because there's just so many variables that contribute to the whole thing. And understanding which weather events and conditions are going to negatively impact the visibility in your particular area is another reason why localized scuba and diving groups can be a massively useful source of information. Other than that, guys, it's just experience. You've just got to be out there and learn from it all. And then when you do finally get one of those days and everything's amazing and it lines up for you, you've got to remember that you still need the animals to play their part. It's quite easy to forget that we're talking about wild animals here that have absolutely zero fucks to give about your hopes, your dreams, and your aspirations of taking amazing fucking photos. They do whatever the fuck they want. I've had weekends where on the Saturday, the place has been chock full of sharks, 30 plus, they've been everywhere and it's been awesome. The very next day, the place has been an absolute fucking ghost town. It is the most frustrating and infuriating thing to experience. There's so much we don't know about these animals, so it's just so hard to predict what they're going to do, which is why it is so important to really make sure you've got your shit sorted to be able to maximize those times that you get when the conditions are amazing and they're there and everything's awesome.
Awesome!
But before we can even fucking start looking for critters, we need to cover off a few basic things with the drone. First up, a polarizing filter is a must-have for this sort of photography, and having it set up correctly as well. There's a link down in the description to a video where I show how I set up my filters, so if you're not sure how to do it, go and check out that video after you've watched this one. I turn off all of the obstacle avoidance sensors on the drone. It's not a must-do, but there's fucking nothing out around the ocean that you're going to hit, so there's no need to have them on. And it also stops them being falsely triggered by the sun if you're shooting when the sun is really low, and it'll sometimes trigger the sensors and it's just fucking annoying. It just stops that annoyance as well. And because I'll be flying quite low to the water, I don't want the downward sensors getting tricked by the glare and stopping me from getting down as low as what I'd like to. Batteries, the more the better, and also a way to be able to charge them out in the field's a good idea. How I go about this subject is I have a 1500 watt inverter for the car, which is powered via a direct power feed from the battery, which goes to an Anderson plug under my dash. Then the inverter can just sit on the passenger side floor and I can use my regular 240 volt chargers from home. If you are going to use an inverter for this kind of thing, just make sure that you've got a way to monitor your car battery voltage so that you don't end up with a flat battery at the end of the day. I also take a small esky with me in the car, not just to keep drinks cool, but it's actually to cool down batteries. The smart batteries that are found in most drones these days have got a thermal protection circuit in them, and they won't let you start charging them again if they're too hot. So when I bring the drone back, I take the battery out of it, it gets put into a dry bag, and that gets buried in the esky for 15 to 20 minutes to cool the battery down so I can get it back on charge quicker. This is just how I go about things, and it's a method that works great for me. The other obvious option is to just buy more batteries. More expensive, but less hassle. You don't have to have more than one battery, but obviously the longer you can spend in the air, the better the chance of getting the shot. There's no right or wrong here, guys. It's just whatever solution works for your scenario. Now, if there's other drone users in the area, I will actually avoid being near them and I'll go and find another spot to fly from. Many people argue that you should interact with the other drone users and work with each other to avoid each other and all that kind of thing. But in my opinion, the benefits are massively outweighed by the signal interference that you will get when multiple people are flying from the same area. Like, it's all well and good when you're nice and high up in the air. But then when you're 5, 6, 7, 800 meters out and you want to drop down to like 2 or 3 meters off the water to start photographing a shark, I can tell you from experience that you are definitely going to start having more signal quality issues than you would be if you're flying with nobody else around you. So the drone's all prepped. Conditions are fucking amazing. Set the drone out. We're all excited. Yeah, we're going to go fucking find some ocean critters. And then you're like, fuck, ocean's kind of big and it's full of stuff. And the stuff I'm looking for is really fucking tiny when you're up 100 meters. Well, unless you're looking for whales, but they're actually hard as well. But anyway, it's just like, the fuck am I even looking for here? This one was so daunting at first, and for a long time I felt so lost and useless and frustrated by the whole thing. I think I failed like the first 4 or 5 attempts before I actually found my first sharks to photograph. All I can say is that once you find what you've been looking for, you'll have this light bulb moment and all of a sudden it just makes sense and you're like, oh, that's what it looks like from all the way up here. That's what I needed to be looking for. Fuck. So if you're still hunting for that elusive first ocean critter to shoot, hopefully some of these screen recordings and clips will help and give you guys an idea of what you need to be looking for. I make sure I'm in photo mode so I'm getting the maximum field of view possible on the screen, as video mode is just going to cut the top and bottom parts of your screen for a 16:9 image, and I will also make sure I'm in full screen mode so that the various overlays aren't blocking any part of the image. Just quickly, and I fucking hate having to bring this subject up, but I know that some prick will try to be clever in the comments if I don't at least touch on it. So just be aware, guys, that in every state in Australia, there is regulations covering the use of drones near marine mammals. It's just something to be aware of. We're all adults. We can all make our own decisions. End of story. Moving on. So hopefully now you've got a better idea of what you need to be looking for, but then what do we do once we find something? Well, we go and fucking shoot it, don't we? There is still a few things that we need to keep in mind though. I'll always try to get as low to the subject as I can. The more you can fill the frame with the subject, the better the image is going to be. If you're not comfortable getting the drone really close to the water, then you just need to harden the fuck up if you want to get the shot. It really is as simple as that. Maybe try to do some flying in an area that's nice and quiet where you can get the drone nice and low to the water and keep it line of sight at the same time. This will just help give you a better idea of how close it looks like you are versus how close you actually are. And with a bit of practice, hopefully you'll just gain a bit of confidence. One thing that you really do need to avoid though is the downward wake from the drone affecting the water surface. Not only is this going to create undesirable ripples on the surface, but the animals, sharks especially, will pick up on it and they do not like it. And we want to avoid that at all costs. Also worth noting is that in some scenarios, the shadow of the drone will be obvious enough to the ocean animal that it will disturb them and create an unwanted reaction as well. That one's not as common, and in those situations, you can normally see the shadow yourself extremely obviously in your video feed as well. And yes, if you're a clever cunt, you'll notice I'm wearing a different shirt because the fucking power went out on us yesterday when we were halfway through doing this vlog. Anyway, camera settings. Always shoot in RAW. White balance on auto is fine as well. And this is also one of the few times that I'll not shoot full manual and I'll actually shoot in aperture priority. And I'll aim for an aperture of around f4, f4.5. Not only because it's the sweet spot for image sharpness, but it's also for that little bit of extra depth of field, just in case the autofocus decides to pick up the surface of the water instead of the shark that's actually underneath it. I'll then just use the ISO to keep the shutter speed in a desirable area. I try to avoid having a shutter speed anything under 120th of a second, as it increases the chance of getting motion blur in the shark depending on how fast it's moving. Ideally, I prefer to keep it around 160th or faster, like the faster you can get it, the better. But if you're shooting in the early morning or late afternoon light, then you need to balance your desire for a fast shutter versus a high ISO, because drone camera sensors aren't that great for image noise at the best of times, so you want to keep that ISO as low as possible as well. And in those lower light situations, I might consider either dropping the shutter down to, say, 100th of a second, or maybe even going to f2.8 with the aperture, just to try to balance out the exposure against having to go really, really high with the ISO. An ISO of 800 is as high as I personally like to go with it. I do try to keep it as low as possible though, and I prefer to keep it from around 1 to 400 depending on time of day. My goal for these images is for a clean silhouette with as much detail in the shark as possible, and having to clean up image noise in post just means you're going to lose some of that detail. Again, this is just my own personal opinions and it's how I go about shooting my own images. If you have a fixed aperture drone, then just use the ISO to keep your shutter speed above above the recommendations that I just made. And also be sure to remember that the angle that you're shooting at is maximizing the effect of the polarizing filter. One other thing that's worth noting is exposure compensation. If I've got good calm conditions, then shooting at an EV of 0 is just fine. That's how I shoot all of my images of sharks and rays and things like that. However, if I'm trying to shoot things like whales, or even scenes that you see some people capture where dolphins like jumping through the back of waves and things like that. Basically, any scene where there's going to be breaking water that's going to create white water, then I'll deliberately underexpose the image in an effort to protect the highlight detail in all of that white water. And this is even more important if you're shooting video because you don't have as much dynamic range in video as you do in a photo. There's no golden rule here with this one, and it can be very much situation dependent, like how much white water's in the scene and things like that. But a pretty safe starting point is underexposing by full stop. But don't be afraid to experiment and figure out what works for you and your particular drone, because they're not all the same. I shoot in single shot mode. I find that the burst mode with the drones just doesn't have a big enough gap between each shot for it to be of any use to try to capture the shot. You end up capturing almost the exact same image. And it also just creates lag when it's writing from the memory buffer to the memory card. And that lag means that there is a potential you're going to miss shots. Once I find a subject to shoot, I'll also be keeping an eye out for other drones in the area whilst I'm descending down to it. During summer in the area where I shoot most of my shark images, it's not uncommon to have like 3 or 4 drones above the same shark if it's a good day with good conditions. So you've just got to keep your eyes open. Once I've gotten down to it, I'll decide on the height that I want to shoot it from. I'll make sure it's in focus, and then I'll just patiently follow it along and try to anticipate the shot. When people ask me how I get my ocean animal images, I think this is probably the biggest one that most people underestimate the importance of. You need to learn how to follow and anticipate the shot. It's just like any other form of wildlife photography, which is no surprise really. I'll wait for it to come as close to the surface as I think it's going to come. I'll keep an eye on its silhouette. Do I think the water's distorting its silhouette too much? Have I got the drone correctly positioned to be able to maximize the effect of the polarizer? Can I see wake ripples on the surface of the water from the drone? Or can I see the shadow of the drone in the water? Are my camera settings correct? Am I exposing correctly? There's a lot of things to keep in mind. And then sometimes, just as you think you're about to get your shot, the shark will just fully descend into the deeper water, or you'll all of a sudden realize you're in a section where the water surface is getting more affected by the wind and it goes more ripply and things like that. And you may have to decide to just abort following that particular animal and go and find another one. And if that does happen, do not forget that you have no way of knowing what is directly above you, and you're better off to just assume that there is drones in the air above your one. So instead of just gassing it and going straight up, just go forward for a little bit before you start ascending, and it'll keep you out of the way of any drones that could potentially be above you in the air. Just like any other form of photography, guys, you are not going to get this right the first few times you try it. But if you are persistent and you stick at it and you keep practicing it, you will eventually get something spectacular. Hopefully you've enjoyed this bit of an insight into my process for shooting ocean critters. As absolutely frustrating and infuriating as it can be at times, it's also a massively rewarding niche of photography, and it's one that I'll never get sick of shooting, and I always get excited about going out to shoot. I just find it so unexplainably captivating being able to observe marine animals from the unique perspective offered by a drone. And there is just so much that we don't actually know about the majority of our marine animals, which for me just adds to the fascination. So get out there, guys, start exploring, start practicing, get yourself some absolute belters, and then once it's actually done and I post it, you'll be able to come back and watch the second video, which is where I'll show you how I go about editing all of my marine critter images. So good luck, get after it, guys, and I'll see you next Tuesday.